Hello and welcome to Libero, the podcast about the least important of the least important things, as Alexander Isak might have told you, Sir Al-Rumayyan, the other day. Or, as Urban Spaceman, don't know if that's his real name, put it, predictable and pretentious hogwash by the usual self-aggrandising Suits Corner suspects. Now that description fits Jonathan Wilson, who I think holds the record for most appearances in Suits Corner, perfectly, and it also kind of suits the Athletics' Jack Pitt-Brooke because he wears glasses. I'm Rory Smith of The Observer and Men in Blazers, and I self-identify as a gaslighting word salad merchant. Wilson, is that right? Are you ahead of Barney, Libero's Pete Best, in Suits Corner appearances?
I believe so. Jack's not actually wearing glasses right now, so...
That's because Jack has read the script and he's been a pain in the arse.
I went for a run, so my face is quite hot, so I don't want to wear glasses now in case they steam up.
That is good glasses technique. You can tell you've been wearing glasses for a while. How are you both?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. But I actually wrote to Private Eye to ask them how often I'd been in Suits Corner, because I had at least 50 examples, and I wanted to know if I'd got to my century, and I want to know if anybody else was close. And they never replied.
That's just
bastards.
Rude. I've got to say, I'm sure I've been in. I'm not certain. I don't track it, but I do think I have seen examples of both you and Barney being in where it's just quite a good intro, and if it wasn't about football, there would be nobody would be quibbling with it. It feels a little bit fun spongy to me.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time they just don't get jokes, and a lot of the time they sort of think you should write about football by saying a man kicked a ball and another man kicked a ball and another man stopped him kicking a ball, and that you should never use any kind of imagery or metaphor or simile.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that vibe, but then maybe we are just being bitter and self-aggrandising, so who knows?
I think it's a great advert. I mean, I just think they should pay me. It's pretty much a syndicated column these days, which I don't get paid.
We had this sort of topic lined up. Well, I was going to say for a while. It wasn't for a while. Miguel changed it the other day, despite not actually appearing on the episode. But it feels particularly fitting because we are recording the morning after probably the funniest night of the football season so far, when not only did Russell Martin's Rangers lose 6-0 to Club Brugge, and that's actually the first time that any Belgian team in any competition has ever scored more than 2 goals, but Ruben Amorim's Manchester United, who I heard after the first game of the season were now amazing, were beaten by Grimsby Town in the Carabao Cup on penalties, having been 2-0 down and rescued only from the ignominy of like an actual open play defeat by Harry Maguire. So we're going to talk about like the balance between philosophy and pragmatism and football's thinking on ideology, I guess, and whether the era of ideological coaches is drawing to a close. But I think first we probably have to say something about Amorim, don't we? Does that felt really bad last night?
Yeah, really bad. I think it definitely the worst moment of his tenure. I think it felt like one of those games which will be difficult for him to survive. Not simply for being out of the League Cup or even how it happened, but I think the two things which are really going to wound him are firstly the image of him with his tactics magnets in the rain, trying to protect his laminated tactics board in the dugout and moving them around, which a lot of people incorrectly called subutio. It's not subutio. Subutio isn't magnetic. Pro Action Football was the magnetic one.
This is just in case anyone was in any doubt that Jack does wear glasses. That has proved it.
That, and then also, like, I think maybe even more damaging than that was during the kind of surreal, endless penalty shootout, which they lost. Amorim, unable to watch the penalties and basically kind of quivering with his head down in the dugout, staring at the floor. While the rest of his coaching staff and substitutes watch the penalties. I mean, that is the kind of image that sticks with people. So yeah, a pretty bad night.
Yeah, Adam Cleary, who's a YouTuber and is Miguel's colleague at The Independent, tweeted last night to say that Amorim might just survive the result, but it's really hard to see him long-term surviving that image of him fiddling about with magnetic tiles whilst Manchester United were losing at Grimsby. And I think that's absolutely right. If you think it's one of those things we maybe underestimate a bit, like the power of iconography. Steve McLaren got sacked as much because of the image of the Wally with the brolly as he did losing to Croatia in a World Cup qualifier. Like that, they become the defining things about a manager's whole reputation in a way that can be really corrosive, I think.
Also, afterwards, Amorim talked about how we'll get through the Burnley game, which is this weekend, and then we'll have a talk, which is not which sounds as if it's a manager who's at the very least thinking about the possibility of a change in direction over the course of the break. And when he was doing the press conference afterwards with written journalists, he said, "I would like to say very smart things and very important things. I have nothing to say. That is the biggest problem." Which, frankly, is how I feel when I sit down and record Libero.
Wilson, do you think? I mean, is this it? Is this kind of it? Because a lot of the things he said last night were slightly cryptic, but only slightly, and it did seem to. I mean, even raise the possibility that he might walk.
Yeah, I mean, I'd been slightly baffled, having been at the game against Arsenal on the first weekend. I was slightly baffled by how positive a lot of the reaction was, because I thought, well, look, what we've seen is Arsenal don't feel quite right yet, which is first game of the season, new signs coming in. That's quite normal, and United. You saw that Cunha is good at football. You saw that Brian Mbeumo was good at football. A couple of other players are quite good at football. But it didn't seem to be good at football together. It was all individual stuff. Yes, United could have won it. I think they did shade the XG 1.5 to 1.3, something like that. But you look at what are the actual fundamentals here? Is there any sign of cohesion? No. Is there any sign that midfield with Bruno Fernandes deep in it works? No. Is there any sign they can defend an in-swing set play? Absolutely, categorically not. And those are major things. And then, even after the Fulham game, because I was at Palace, I missed the first half of that game. I only saw the second half. And I had people say, they played 25 minutes of the first half. They were really good. But I watched it back. Where were these 25 minutes? Where they weren't just a series of individuals who occasionally do quite nice things. And so, last night, and you're right, Louis van Gaal went out of the League Cup 4-1 to MK Dons. A terrible result, terrible performance. But in the second half last night, he was playing his three forwards, who he's paid 200 million, or the club has paid 200 million pounds for. They looked totally open on the break, which is I'm sceptical about 3-4-2-1 as a formation for a top side. I think a team like Palace, who are comfortable playing without the ball, it works for them, and we can get into the details of that if you want to or not.
No.
Anyway, but the one thing it should be good at is it gives you that 3-2 shape at the back of midfield, which is the way a lot of teams like to stop the counter. And Guardiola achieves that in various different ways. At times it's been one fullback one fullback pushes forward, the rest of the defence slide over. It can be John Stones stepping out of the back four to form a second midfielder. It can be a midfielder goes forward and one of the fullbacks comes in the midfield. But that 3-2 shape is probably the most popular way for teams to set up to counter a counter-attack. And the 3-4-2-1 should give you that as standard. You don't have to have anybody moving. You've already got the three central defenders and the two holding midfielders in front of them. And yet every time Grimsby countered, they looked like scoring. Every set play, they looked like scoring. And then the point about that image of Amorim sort of just rocking on the bench, looking. I mean, I suspect during this episode we'll be talking a lot about faith. We'll be talking a lot about religious metaphors. That was a man who had no faith whatsoever in his team. And to be honest, part of your job as a manager is to at least pretend you have faith. And the contrast I would draw is, do you remember the ghost goal game when Liverpool beat Chelsea in the Champions League semi-final?
Wasn't a ghost goal, definitely over the line, but yes.
And would have been a penalty anyway. That's not.
And would have been a penalty and a red card. So if Jose wants his goalkeeper sent off after 5 minutes, whatever, fine, not a problem.
But it goes to penalties, and what does Rafa Benitez do for that penalty shootout?
Oh, he sat down, didn't
he? Sits down cross-legged, takes up the lotus pose on the touchline, projecting. He's the calmest manager any manager's ever been going into this Champions League semi-final penalty shootout. Does that mean, is that why they win the penalty shootout? No, of course it's not. But does it add 1 or 2%? Yeah, maybe. And certainly gives you a better chance of winning it than your manager looking like he's, in a hospital in Scotland, having gone through the trenches in the First World War.
I think, and far be it from me to correct you, I think that's the 2007 penalty shootout. I think the ghost goal won the
right.
game. Yeah,
you are right. Sorry,
but I take the point absolutely stands. there is a tendency, I think, to look at United struggles under Amorim as inherently quite funny. And obviously I have my biases in that sense, personal, not professional. And yeah, Manchester United ruined a lot of people's childhoods by winning constant league titles. And there will be a very, very, very sort of shallow well of sympathy for Manchester United from quite a lot of people, probably of like Jack's age and up, because you remember what they did to you effectively. But at the same time, I now find the situation with Amorim quite hard to watch. He seems to me, he's a very good communicator. He seems like a good guy. He's quite charismatic. He seems kind of to have his, I don't know, like there's something quite nice about Ruben Amorim. He seems like a decent person, and to watch him struggling like this is, I would quite like it if he resigned, to be honest, and just put himself out of his misery. I think a lot of what you saw last night is not kind of good for his mental health. Like, that's too much pressure to be under at work, to be honest, if you think about it like that. That just is, it feels excessive. And I had the same as you, Jonathan. I watched that Arsenal game. I wasn't there. Don't have to work Sundays. And I kind of watched it and I thought, United have been okay. They've been sort of all right. They didn't really hurt Arsenal at any point. They created a few half chances, but most teams will create a few half chances in the course of a game. Arsenal didn't look very good, but they did what they needed to do. And then doing Men in Blazers and doing the Monday Night Club on 5 Live, all of this talk was about how, about the green shoots of positivity at United. And I think there's an element of, gaslighting is a loaded word and it's not right in this context. But there was definitely like a right think that I think was set by a lot of the Manchester-based journalists who covered that game of, this has been really encouraging. And you start to trick yourself, as you talk about them on these various platforms, into thinking, actually, that was quite encouraging. But if I'm honest, I didn't see that. They just looked like a mid-table Premier League team being relatively comfortably beaten by an underperforming title contender. They looked like, if that had been like Bournemouth or West Ham, it was that sort of performance, wasn't it? And that's after a full pre-season. It's after 200 million plus in the transfer market. It's after he's had a chance to shape the squad in his image. It's after 9 months or whatever of training them to play this mad formation that he refuses to change. The fact that it still isn't working is that there surely is a point at which someone has to say, right, we need to kind of call this quit.
And he has got a lot of patience. I know he's not been there for a whole calendar year yet, and he hasn't had a full season, but he's had 29 league games, and he's got 28 points.
That's bad.
And it probably isn't relegation form anymore because the bar for relegation is lower than it used to be, right? Teams are now generally more in the 20s and the 30s in points. But it's really bad, and it's especially bad for Manchester United, and especially bad for Manchester United who've spent hundreds of millions of pounds on players. And it's just always felt to me, and I know we will get onto this later, but it's always felt to me like his fundamental approach has required taking such a roundabout route. Like it's we've talked about this on previous episodes. It's no secret that Liverpool considered Amorim when they were after Jurgen Klopp's departure, and I gather that one of their conclusions was that yes, he's a very good coach, but simply to get in somebody who was only going to play this particular system would require a total retooling of the squad, which would cost 500 million pounds. And obviously Man United have chosen to go down this particular route, and it's been such a circuitous route that they're no closer to where they want to be now than when they started.
And this is the problem, isn't it? That I don't think the people who appointed him understood that his way of playing did not suit anybody in that squad. It's a remarkable thing to do. You take this squad that's been put together over 6 managers, totally disparate, and the only thing they have in common is none of them have played 3-4-2-1 before. And so you appoint a coach who plays 3-4-2-1. And that was, it was apparently part of the reason why Dan Ashworth left. That I think maybe he was talking more about Premier League experience, but certainly the sense that it doesn't matter whether he's a good coach. He's not a fit for these players. And we then need to change 20, 25 players. And they've begun that. They've brought in 3 forwards who, I don't know, may or may not be able to play that system. But by doing that, they've had to then move Amad Diallo and Bruno Fernandes, who you'd say were 2 of their better players last season. The idea of Amad Diallo playing as a wing-back just seems you're asking him to you learn a new way of doing things when he was one of your better players last season. Bruno Fernandes playing deep in midfield. You look at the teams who have used 3-4-2-1 successfully, And Palace have Adam Wharton and Will Hughes. So one of them who's a very un-English player, positionally very adept, great at distribution, plus a really aggressive ball winner. Or you look at when Conte's Chelsea won the league with 3-4-2-1. The only team since Everton 1962-3 to win the league playing a back three as their fundamental formation, which might lead you to ask, is there something about English football that means back threes don't work? Which is maybe another discussion, but at least you should be asking yourself a question, why is this unusual? Who was the back of Chelsea's midfield that year? It was N'Golo Kante, literally the best holding midfielder we've ever seen in the Premier League. Incredible dynamism, does the work of two players, and a good pass to the ball. Plus either Cesc Fabregas or Nemanja Matic. Again, both really good passes of the ball. Okay, Bruno Fernandes may be a very good passer of the ball, but he's not necessarily a good passer of the ball from that position, and he doesn't have any of the experience playing defensively. But as you spend more money in this, and as you start to phase out the players who can't fit, like is it really worth sacrificing Kobbie Mainoo, probably the best young player United have produced in a decade, on the altar of Amorim's faith, when there is no... Why would you think this would work? It feels like they've gone so far with this, they almost dare not have another half revolution. It's like Macbeth after he started the murders, that I am in blood steeped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go. They even if it's a terrible idea, we might as well finish it now, because stopping halfway is just the worst of both worlds. And I think that is the danger, that if you get rid of Amorim now, you've now started to construct the squad to play with this back three. And the new manager probably won't want to do that. And then you have people like Dorgu who just don't fit in.
It sounds to me like you're almost making an argument for sticking with him. For precisely that reason. It would be they are so pot committed to this particular approach, and they have started to bring in players, although not many of I don't really think they've brought in a lot of players who were good at this system. But because they've started this process, and because starting again would be, I know it's pure like sunk cost fallacy, but they're so, even then, maybe it is worth pursuing at least until the end of this season.
If you lose Mainoo, I'm not sure it is. I think I would have got rid of the end of last season. And I know that it would have been an admission of failure. It would have been, I just think the work they have to do to construct the squad in a way that even to get to a position where the team looks like how Amorim wants it to look, will take 2 more windows, 3 more windows, £200-300 million more. There's going to be a lot of casualties in that. People like Mainoo, players you're discarding for no real reason, just that they don't fit this system. And I now start to think that even if you get to that point, I don't think 3-4-2-1 is appropriate for a team like Manchester United or what they want to be.
I wonder whether the Mainoo thing is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. I realise that's an unintellectual cliche, and I can't cope with, quoting Shakespeare or whatever the fallacy was that Jack mentioned. They're both way beyond my intellectual level. But it does strike me that feels like an inflection point, that you're basically being forced to choose between, as you say, kind of the brightest talent you've produced in your academy for X number of years, or a manager whose domestic record is appalling. And it feels weird that a club might, for reasons of pride or reasons of economics or whatever it might be, choose the latter rather than the former. Whether Kobbie Mainoo is good enough to build a Champions League contending Manchester United team around, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't think there's any evidence either way, to be honest. But Amorim, it was strange last season, especially after Bilbao, that there was so little talk of him being sacked, given his record. And I know that all of these circumstances are different, and that the requirements of the job vary. But even if you just compare him to Vitor Pereira at Wolves, like Vitor Pereira went in to a club that's basically got no investment, been drifting for years, and turned them into a pretty competent team that avoided relegation really easily, admittedly, because there were 3 terrible sides in the Premier League. But, Wolves, by the end of the season, they'd had a couple of good runs of form. They'd put, a couple of, I think, 5 or 6 game unbeaten streaks together. Pereira made them look competent. And no one's saying that Vitor Pereira is like the greatest manager in the world. It looks to me an awful lot like United they've missed a step. What you need is the competent pragmatist manager who allows you to reshape the squad, allows the sporting director or directors to reshape the squad to the club's liking according to the club's kind of vision. And it's at that point that you go and get the manager who can execute. Whereas United are, whoever, whatever Jason Wilcox's role is, they're having to recruit players who can play this one specific system. And whether Wilson's right or not, that it isn't appropriate for a team in the Premier League to have kind of what United would consider success, I don't know. But it's a very specific way of playing. So you have to reshape the squad to meet that specific way of playing. And you're doing it, you're kind of putting all your eggs in this one manager's basket. And there's not really any evidence that basket, I can't finish this metaphor, that basket is any good, that it has a structural cohesion, I don't know.
It's a basket with holes in it.
It's a basket with holes in it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because I think that and this kind of ties back to our broader theme about ideology, is that Amorim seems to have approached this job in the way that a Guardiola or a Conte would approach a job like this, which is to go in and say, I have my ideas. These ideas are the gospel truth. If we implement them, and if you buy me the players who can fit them, we will be really good. And I can see why he would do that, because that's been the story of his career. Like he was astonishingly successful at Sporting, a team which had won basically almost nothing for 20 years, off the back of exactly this approach. Having started, even when he's starting out at Braga, like, again, he was fantastically successful from minute one. So I can see why he would go in with this idea at Man United. And to be fair, I feel like the board at Man United have tried to deliver for him, and they've tried to give him the patience. The problem is, I think that to realise that kind of management, to make it work, you do need really good players. Like, it's no secret that Guardiola is only able to implement his ideas to the level he has at Manchester City because of the quality of players that he had. And even in his first season at City, they were pretty bad. I think they just scraped fourth with 66 points. It was only really when they could get, Kyle Walker and Edison and players of that level, Bernardo Silva, that they were able to become this kind of brilliant 100-point team. So, but I feel like Amorim is almost aiming too high enough, or rather Manchester United are aiming too high by getting a Guardiola Conte-style manager. Whereas in hindsight, I'm sure what Rory says is right. Like, what they probably needed after Ten Hag was not Amorim, but rather someone to just keep the ship afloat.
And that, I think, will take us quite nicely on what was meant to be today's discussion, which is about the kind of balance between pragmatism and philosophy. But I think we should do that after a musical interlude. This is kind of the subject that we had in mind, regardless of results at Grimsby last night, which is that Amorim's struggles, and I think prior to that, the issue around Ange Postecoglou at Tottenham in particular, seem to have turned the conversation around a little bit, whereby we are now increasingly sceptical, not necessarily of managers who have visions of the way the game should be played, but managers who are sort of totally, absolutely, unquestioningly devoted to that approach. And it feels like the struggles of Amorim, taken with the successes of Thomas Frank at Tottenham in the very early days at Tottenham, have kind of tilted the discussion a little bit. After several years where managers who had philosophies were very much de rigueur, where there was no question that you had, if you were a serious club with serious ambitions, you hired a manager with a philosophy, and that riled quite a lot of football traditionalists. So I wanted to start by asking Jonathan, who is famously a football historian, when you think we can date this idea that a manager should have a specific style of play, that they should almost be synonymous with an idea of what football should look like. When did that start? Because it feels to me like in the olden times, so pre-1992, national styles were much more kind of calcified. There was an idea that teams in certain countries played in certain ways, and there were always variations on that, but the basic principles were national rather than varying from manager to manager.
But I think that's completely true. That, for instance, after England won the World Cup in 1966, and you've also got Shankly and Revie being successful, that sort of method style of football, the back four, the beginnings of pressing, that becomes totally standard for English football. The World Cup win obviously just sort of confirms in people's minds, this is how we do it. But of course, that itself was revolutionary in its day, because England had been stunned in 1953 by Hungary that turns out the WM with wingers is not the way you have to play. And it was such a shock happening November 53, that 6-3 defeat to Hungary, because it comes 6 months after the Matthews final, which has seemed to confirm what everybody thinks, which is that wing play is the way you have to go. The great apogee of the English style comes 6 months before it's destroyed. And that sends English football into this period of tumultuous introspection, the like of which I think we've maybe 2008 sort of cast it into something similar, but a very unusual period of sort of really rethinking our basic principles about the game. But having said that, I think you can identify two slightly different and maybe contradictory elements to this. So I think there has, from the very beginnings of football, there's been a sense of a right way to play. So a lot of the amateur teams of the 1870s got very upset with the northern professional teams for kicking the ball too far, for hitting long passes. And it's not really, it's all about dribbling. It's this sort of passing or punting at 50 yards. It feels a bit, don't know about that. These sort of working class people not doing it quite right because they're just trying to win rather than enact this sort of beautiful artifact. And I think you see a sort of the last sort of echoes of that in 1922 when Huddersfield win the cup final 1-0, beat Preston in the cup final. And Herbert Chapman's the manager, and they do it by playing their centre half quite deep, essentially to pick up Preston centre forward. And the FA send a letter to Huddersfield sanctioning them for it.
Mm.
And Herbert Chapman replies, I don't know what you're talking about. You haven't laid out what I've done wrong. And the FA replied, we think you know. So the idea that there was a right way to play is so sort of deeply coded that the FA feel they don't need to express it. Or at the very least, they can see a deviation from that. So the idea that the right way to play and the winning way to play, not necessarily the same thing, I think is there very, very early. But in terms of talking about this in terms of quasi-religious philosophies, I think it's Total Football, I think it's Cruyff, I think it's Michels. And I'm not even sure it was them doing it initially, but I think the way people talked about that then leads to this sense of... And I think as well that the way that Michels and Cruyff take that to Barcelona and they only win one league title, but there is a sense of we're doing revolutionary things, we're doing things the right way. Maybe even the fact that the Netherlands don't win that World Cup final, but there is somehow a sense of triumph or validation even in defeat because they've done it the right way. I think possibly that is where it first comes from. And then you get this idea of the Dutch style, the Dutch method, the Dutch philosophy. And I think also just the way the Dutch talk about football, the sort of canal belt intellectuals, that sort of they're framing football as this intellectual act in a way that probably hadn't been done. And I know you're desperate for me to get there. I'll get at the end. In a way that hadn't been done since the coffee houses of Vienna and Budapest in the 1930s.
Play the hits. So it is interesting because I think that, and look, you know much more about this than I do, but like, if you look at like Vic Buckingham and Arthur Rowe, there is what was that called? It wasn't Hit and Rush, it was
Push and Run.
Push and Run, that's it. Which then becomes kind of Pass and Move, famously the Liverpool groove. So there were these kind of principles that were admired in English football, but it does feel as though the desire to have an ism, whether that's Cruyffism, Michelsism, or in Argentina kind of Bilardismo and Menottismo, that feels very foreign. Like we would never have talked about pass and move at Liverpool as being a philosophy. It might have been a style of play. It might occasionally have been a way. English football quite likes a way, doesn't it? But the idea of kind of intellectualising it always seemed basically like a foreign affectation, I think, to England.
Yeah, I think that English football has traditionally, right up until I'd say about 7 or 8 years ago, been very anti-intellectual. So as Rory says, Liverpool way, or like a brand, you can have a brand of football. I guess the West Ham way is also in a sense a brand of football. Yeah. That's fine. But the idea of having a philosophy, like we can see, I mean, we've got an incredibly good example of this, which is the way that Louis van Gaal was treated when he was Manchester United manager from 2014 to 2016. Like people used to scorn him for the temerity of having an idea. Like the fact that he had ideas was almost looked down upon. And I think this is something, I mean, this is an element of English football which obviously has very deep roots in the rest of in English cultural history itself. Like there's that famous line in The Lion and the Unicorn where Orwell writes, "As Europeans go, the English are not intellectual. They have a horror of abstract thought. They feel no need for any philosophy or systematic worldview." And like that has been the story of English football, I think, right up really until Guardiola. It was only I think Guardiola, Conte, Klopp in the last 10 years, guys who've come in with clear ideas and realised their ideas on the pitch and got to kind of 95 to 100 point tallies, that we've really done a kind of big national 180 on the idea of having an idea. And we've totally changed our mind as a country on the merits of coming in with a philosophy.
That is Pep. Like, as much as we talk about his legacy in terms of now even teams in League Two invert their fullbacks. Like, the main thing that he has given English football is that we now expect, I think, as standard, managers to have a way of playing, right? Or at least a kind of not idiosyncratic, but like characteristic type of football. We expect a manager to basically be a synonym for a certain set of, a certain style or a certain set of principles or whatever it might be. I do wonder. It strikes me that the word philosophy is generally reserved for what Wilson was talking about in terms of the posh amateurs of the 1870s. Like, it's generally reserved for playing in the right way. Like, you very rarely hear an inherently cautious manager described as having a philosophy. Like, Sean Dyche's way of playing is his way of playing. It's not Sean Dyche's philosophy. It seems like it's a word now that is only used really to have a positive connotation. Is that fair?
I think that's probably true, but I also touches on another point, which is it's not that this didn't exist in English football. We just didn't discuss it in the same way. And Jack is right. This comes down to this profound. I guess is it anti-intellectualism? I guess on some level it is, but sort of a distrust of theory. There's British philosophy is empirical. Bishop Berkeley is an empiricist, and there's the sort of the famous story of some Parisian bloke looks at London sewers in the late 19th century and says, "Wow, these are incredible. We need to get some British engineers in." So they get the British engineers over, and they look at the Parisian sewers and they sort of come up with a plan. And they go to the meeting and they say, "Look, it's a bit rough and ready, but it should work in practice." And the French bureaucrat says, "Well, that's all very well, but will it work in theory?" As a sort of exemplar of how the two cultures look at things. And you even look at those early sort of coaching courses at Lilleshall that people like Jack Charlton loved and thrived on. But Brian Clough, Bill Shankly were like, what's this? This is nonsense. We shouldn't be thinking about the game. And yet clearly they did think about the game. They just did it in a very sort of practical way. Clough had but certainly by the end, had a very distinct style of play. It was never described as a philosophy. Clough himself hated talking about tactics. He thought it was ridiculous. He thought it was needless anti-intellectualism. Needless over-intellectualism. And equally, you look at how did Graham Taylor play. You can describe a Graham Taylor way of playing. Nobody would have called it the Graham Taylor philosophy. Or Dave Bassett. Or, long ball football is a philosophy. It's just not particularly intellectual. It's not something that people are going to sort of evangelize about. So I think you're right. I think the word philosophy in football has come to mean sort of a coherent plan that almost certainly is to do with high press, possession football. But of course, these people who copy Pep don't seem to acknowledge that Guardiola himself is always changing.
Well, and this is what I find fascinating. I think Jack disagrees with me on this. I find it fascinating that Pepism now basically refers to not only this like vast array of managers, all of whom play in quite different ways, but the two most kind of pronounced disciples of Pep, and certainly most direct disciples of Pep, Enzo Maresca and Mikel Arteta, both former assistants, both now managing teams challenging for the Premier League title. They have such diametrically opposed ways of playing. My theory, and Jack, feel free to tell me I'm wrong. My theory is that basically you can tell the difference between master and apprentice because Pep keeps changing what he does. And both Arteta and Maresca to me seem to they've taken the principles that were Pep's principles at the point they left and frozen them in amber. So Maresca is much more about sterile possession. It's a sort of older version of Pepism, whereas Arteta left at the point where Pep was going, right, let's play 4 centre-halves and be really big. And he's been like, well, all right, that's what we're going to do. We're going to have this really sort of solid defensive team that he's now gradually and probably belatedly trying to add a little bit more kind of attacking spice to. It feels like, yeah, Pepism is now such an overarching, I guess like any religion, it becomes such an overarching thing that there are individual strands of interpretation that on the surface look quite different, even if they have the same root.
Yeah, I always found it, I actually don't disagree with you. I think that one of the fascinating things about Pepism now is that the Guardiola legacy is so broad that it can contain people who play radically different football. So Arteta is obviously a Pep. Arteta was obviously part of this. You know, he was Pep. He sat at Pep's right hand for years at City and was his kind of fixer and enforcer, and the football that he's taken from Pep, I think, is a very sort of, it feels like kind of late era Pep at City. It's all about control, physical dominance. Don't let anything happen on the pitch that's going to surprise you. Push every single margin, set pieces, etc. So you can kind of see the way that this borrows from Guardiola, but it's not, this is not like early era Guardiola in any sense. But then if you look at, say, Ange Postecoglou, who never worked with Guardiola, but was always accused, if you remember, of copying Pep. This was when he showed up at Tottenham, this is the one thing that people used to always hammer him for, like, you're just copying Pep, aren't you? And he used to make a joke about it. But the way that his Spurs team played, particularly in his first 18 months at Spurs, before injuries really kicked in, was like the polar opposite of Arteta. It wasn't about control, really. It was about physical intensity. The fullbacks don't invert to defend against the counter-attack. The fullbacks invert so they can get into the opposition penalty area. It's so different from how Arteta played, and it's incredibly high variance, and it produces some brilliant results and then some disastrous ones. But the fact that both of these people can be said to have descended from the Guardiola intellectual tree, that's another mixed metaphor for us, just I think shows the breadth of the legacy.
So if we assume that all of these managers are drawing from Pep certain ideas, but I think it remains true that what they have really taken from Pep more than anything else is the idea that you have to have a thing. You, as a manager, you now have to have a philosophy. You have to stand for something. Do we think that is purely because they have come from Guardiola's sort of intellectual tree? Or is there something else at play? Because our colleague James Horncastle, and I want to credit Horny for this rather than just stealing it, which is what I do to most of the rest of you. Horny's theory is that the reason that having a brand, a philosophy, has become so kind of fashionable is because that's how you get jobs. That if you need to sell yourself as a manager to, not to fans necessarily, but first and foremost, you have to sell yourself to executives. And it's much easier, much more convincing to go in there and say, I play this system, I have these ideas, I have this reference from Pep Guardiola, this is who I am, this is what I do, to a set of executives who will be, they're used to like KPIs and they're used to like strategies, and they probably all listen to the High Performance podcast, and that's kind of what they want, rather than going in, and Horny and I have talked about this, but I know we're not allowed to call him Horny anymore. We talked about this, James and I, in terms of Max Allegri, that Max Allegri's been in for all these jobs. But the problem with Allegri is that he will go in and be like, I like to see the players' legs. Their players are like racehorses. You have to go and see their legs and see how they're moving, and then you know that they're ready. I think that's what he means. I'm not really sure. It sounds much better in Italian. Allegri goes in and basically says to people, give me your players, I'm a good coach, I'll figure it out, don't worry. That's not what people really want from a job interview for a manager anymore.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a truth to that. I think particularly for young managers or managers who don't have experience. I mean, Allegri, I think, didn't get the level of job he should have done after Juventus, despite having done really well there. And so if you're a young manager who hasn't won however many Serie A titles, despite having got to 2 Champions League finals, if you're a manager who's just starting out, you can't go into an interview and say, well, what I'll do is I'll look at the problems and I'll work out the best way to solve them, and then I'll solve them. I did that with the third team or the under-17s. Nobody's going to listen to that. You've got to present this grand vision. I think that is true.
It's funny, isn't it? Does it in normal job interviews for most jobs, one of the key questions is, can you give us an example of when you faced adversity and how you overcame it?
Well, what I did was I applied my principles, which are the following. But I actually think in football that's not the worst thing to. Football's a very noisy space, and this is one of the things I think about. I hope we do an episode on this at some point. But if you look at Charles Reap, the sort of godfather of football data, certainly in England. His numbers are wrong. He gets it badly wrong, but he has early success when clubs apply his ideas, because at some level, an idea is always better than no idea. And so if you have a team who, we worked with Brentford when we were in the third division, if you have a team who just keep punting it to the back post, and everyone in the Brentford team knows we get the ball, punt it to the back post, and the Brentford forwards know run to the back post, and you're doing that consistently, it will be better than late 1940s teams who are sort of wandering about, kind of trying to work out what they're doing as they're going. And suddenly they come up against this sort of, this really organised... Of course, it's really easy to stop once you know what's going on. And as I say, his numbers are flawed. But some idea is better than no idea. And so having your core principles... And there's a moment I think is really, really telling with Guardiola that... It's in the 14-15 season when he's at Bayern. So he's already been very successful as a coach. And in the 18th game of that season, they were unbeaten in the first 17. In the 18th game, they get beaten 4-1 by Wolfsburg. Kevin De Bruyne's brilliant for Wolfsburg. And Bastos, I think, gets 2 goals as well that day. And it's a bit of a freakish game, but they lose 4-1. And so Guardiola blames himself for this. And he locks himself, as he does, he locks himself away to have a think. And what he does is, he writes down what he calls his Bible, very short Bible. It's got 3 lines on the whiteboard in his office, and those three lines are 2 against 4 in attack, an extra man in midfield, an extra man in defence, and that is such a simple thing. It's so Cruyff, right? That is the essence of Cruyff. Have 1 more defender than they have forwards. If they have one forward, you can have 2 defenders. You don't have to have 4. If they have 2 forwards, you have 3. You have an extra man in midfield, so you can dominate possession. And then if that means you're 2v4 front, well, so be it. It also actually means that a lot of Guardiola teams should play 4-4-2, which is quite an odd... and he does play 4-4-2 the next game, and of course they go on to be very successful that season. So I think having core principles you can fall back on in that noisy space of football, I think is very useful.
And that I think is probably where we can land in terms of that balance between pragmatism and philosophy, isn't it, Jack? That you do have to have... You probably can't be an elite manager now who doesn't have a certain set of ideas that just apply throughout. You can't go in, and I'm sure Allegri doesn't do this really anyway. You can't go in and be like, well, I'll just see what's going on, lads. Just see what's going on, see what you got, then I'll have a look at it. You can't take like the kind of dropping your car off at the garage approach of like, just see what's wrong with it and then fix that bit. You have to go in and be like, well, these are the things I'm going to do, and once I've done them, we'll kind of see everything else around the sides. We'll have a look and we'll see what works and what doesn't. But this is kind of what I do, because, and we touched on this when we were talking about Amorim earlier. And I think this is something that isn't kind of reflected enough in coverage. Being a manager is basically a sales job. You are selling yourself to the board first and foremost, then the fans and the players, and you have to have something to sell, I think, for that to work.
Yeah, so I think there's, the first thing on Guardiola, this is why I think that the Guardiola legacy is not just the ideas and the way that his teams play football and have played football since he got the Barcelona job. It's also the idea of having an idea. It's the idea of going into a job with a clear set of principles which guide how you play in almost all circumstances. And of course, like as you said, like those, you can tweak exactly how you play and you can tweak formation. Guardiola has changed a lot, but it's the motivating idea of having ideas, I think, is as much of his legacy as, defending on the halfway line or winning the ball back in 3 seconds or the fullbacks inverting or whatever. But and I think that is why so many managers in the last 15 years have had that approach. But I also think you're right that when you said it's a sales job, like if you talk to managers in private, one of one thing that they always say to you is that the most important thing that you can have in any new job is buy-in. Like you cannot get anything done unless you have complete buy-in from the players. And that's why, when a manager starts, they will often get rid of, they will sideline players in their first year or so. It's not necessarily because the players aren't good enough, although often that is the case. It's because they don't buy in. Like you need to create that. I mean, you call it sales. To me, it's more religious. Like you need to convince the players that what you're selling is the gospel, and you need to turn them into disciples, basically. And only then, when you have that combination of the manager with his very clear ideas and the players who believe this is the absolute truth and who will therefore do everything to realize those ideas on the pitch, those are basically the necessary conditions for having an elite, successful football team in the modern era, I think.
Yeah, and I think if you want to listen back to our Mourinho episode, which I wasn't on, did either of you two do the Mourinho episode? I can't remember.
I did.
Yeah. A lot of that, I can't remember who brought it up, but if you talk to the players who were at that Porto team, they still refer to Mourinho in kind of quasi-religious terms. Like it is very much like he could tell the future and stuff. I thought that was really interesting. It's a great episode. You should listen to it if you haven't. I remember going to see Xabi Alonso in Leverkusen the year before last, so the start of the season they won the title, and he's obviously got this incredible background in terms of his intellectual influences: Jose, Carlo, Pep, Rafa Benitez, like the four, and people sort of snicker when you include Rafa in that list, but he was the other one to Mourinho for a long time in terms of kind of preeminent managers of his generation. He fell by the wayside quicker than Jose, but it's still it's a big name manager to work for. And I think a lot of people would like to think that Xabi's main inspiration, his main influence would be Pep, because they played in the same position. They were both very intellectual players as players. It would make sense if Xabi was kind of continuing his work and he was going to have his Aloncismo kind of vision of play. But Xabi says that the manager he learnt the most from was Carlo, because Carlo had this ability to understand what players wanted, to understand what players needed, how to get the best out of them, to interact with them on a personal level in a way that I think Jose and Rafa and Pep are much more kind of outwardly, they're much more like firebrand religious figures, whereas Carlo is, I don't know, maybe he's like the pastor who puts his arm around your shoulder and kind of says, this is the word of the Lord or whatever. Like, if you've got this problem, then God can help you. Maybe that's Carlo's vision of religion. It's not quite the fire and brimstone. You've got to do this or that, you'll be going to hell, which is kind of Guardiola, Rafa and Jose. It was, Carlo's is a much more modern religious approach. And that's what Xabi's that's really mangled. But that's what Xabi has kind of learned, I think, from those four managers, is that you have to have your ideas of play and your kind of uncorruptible principles and the things that are your non-negotiables, all the stuff that Jade Humphrey loves. But you also need to have that ability to understand the player on a human level to make it work, because you need that buy-in. You need them to believe in you. You need them to believe that you have an answer. And obviously in that season at Leverkusen, that's what Alonso did. Does that make sense, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's interesting how much religious terminology is used. I mean, Guardiola himself used it of Cruyff, that Cruyff built the cathedral, our job is to renovate it. There's explicit religious imagery. So I think probably subconsciously there is a sense among certain coaches of themselves as quasi-religious figures. Or you listen to Xavi describing the way he wants to play and how disgusted he is by the infidels who defend and stop his teams from playing the beautiful passing football. And there's a real sort of sanctimoniousness there. And so I think he is sort of... I mean, Xavi strikes me as being the worst kind of really fussy, pedantic religious figure. You're constantly looking for fault in others. But I think as well there is a danger in this. I guess if you are religious, then you believe your religion is right and it will prevail, whether in this life or later. The danger if you as a manager turn up thinking, well, my philosophy, my dogma is right, that it will win, is that football is a very, particularly the Premier League, And I think we saw this with Ange Postecoglou really clearly. You can turn up with some great ideas, and if you do them 10 times in a row, everybody's worked it out and they start trying to stop you. And I think we at times underestimate how tough the Premier League is. That you've got 19, if you're a manager, you've got 19 other brilliant managers, 19 of the best people in the world at that job trying to stop you. And they're backed up by incredibly well-resourced teams of analysts and coaches and players. And if you just keep doing the same thing, you get found out. And so that's why you see a lot of managers come in, have quite a good start, and then very quickly, for want of a better expression, they get worked out. And then if you have nothing apart from your philosophy, you end up like Russell Martin, just spouting the lines and looking increasingly ridiculous as you get worse and worse results.
It's interesting you mentioned Postecoglou. I think that's a really kind of important example because, and Jack, you covered this much more than me or even Wilson. Postecoglou was kind of the arch fundamentalist. Like he was. That was the thing about. There was that press conference when he was at Celtic. I think they were about to play Real Madrid, and it was very much like, "This is who we are, mate. This is what we do. There's no point changing it just as we're playing a team that are much better than us." And that was kind of his great strength when he came in. Was this is Ange ball. This is kind of his vision. Me and Rog on Men in Blazers had this thing of. He turned Spurs fans into Postecoglouites, that there were these people who just believed in everything Ange was doing because he stood by them so firmly. But I think, and you'll have to tell me whether this is true or not, like I think their success in the Europa League last season had nothing to do with his basic principles of play. Like I think Ange did change massively towards the end of last season. And I think equally interesting is that people didn't notice. The conversation around him, I'm sure Spurs fans did, but the conversation around Postecoglou was still very much, does he need to change? And you're thinking, well, I'm sure he has, because they're not playing the way they normally do. This is much more it's much more pragmatic, much more, I mean, not defensive is the wrong word, but much more kind of constrained. And yet the overall conversation in terms of the way he was presented in the media, the way that pundits talked about him, the way that he was discussed on TV, was still the same one. It was just like, well, we've decided this is the thing we think about Ange Postecoglou, so that's what we're going to say.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting paradoxes of Ange's time at Tottenham, right? Is that Ange ball only really lasted for about 18 months. Like it was basically abandoned in the halfway point of last season. I think because it was brilliant on its day when everyone was fit, particularly Romero and Van der Ven, the two best and most important players. And when everyone was fit, and when the team was and it was so reliant on physicality as well, they needed to be able to outrun the opponents. You know, when they're on their day, they produced some of the best running stats in the league, and when they did that, they always won. And when they weren't able to hit those physical levels, they didn't win generally. So they had to really adapt in the second half of last season. They ended up playing fairly generic style of play, I think, second half of last year. I think you're right. I think the sort of outside of Spurs world, a lot of the discourse kind of missed that. But the fascinating thing about the Europa League is obviously the Europa League is what he's going to be remembered for. The Europa League was won playing football that was nothing like this, really. You know, when they went to Eintracht Frankfurt and won, really kind of ground it out. They played your favourite team, Bodo Glimt, in the semi-finals, and really ground them down with it was almost like a Mourinho performance. It was very organised, it was very efficient, it was really building the platform to rely on the physical superiority of their players, particularly Richarlison and Solanke and Brennan Johnson.
So do we think
by this point, Maddison and Kulusevski were injured, so they didn't have any technical skill really in midfield either. And then the final against Man United, they were again happy to play a very, very basically the same sort of pragmatic game. You know, very organised, rely on set pieces, get balls into the box, use the physicality of Richarlison and Solanke, and it worked. You know, it worked, and they won the Europa League. But I do think the success of the Europa League doesn't really tell you anything about Ange ball. It just shows that Postecoglou was actually much more able to adapt than his critics said that he was.
So do we think then that in appointing Thomas Frank, who's had this wonderful start as Spurs manager, and I think probably all three of us would agree that it seemed when they appointed him just like a really sensible, yep, that makes sense, that'll work. He's a good manager. They're an underperforming team. This kind of all adds up. His early success, does that suggest that Spurs took a little bit of a lesson from that from that success in the Europa League, from what Ange Ball kind of morphed into, that actually you don't need an abiding principle, you don't need an overarching ideology. What you need in certain circumstances, as we touched on with Manchester United, is someone who can go in and say, I have the things that I consider compulsory, I have basic principles that I will instill into the players, but after that, I'm just going to see what you've got and I'm going to make the most of it, and it will change from game to game, from circumstance to circumstance, and it will change in games as well, because that's what Frank does. Frank's system will switch. If something's not working, he'll change it. If he thinks that he needs to do one thing against a specific opponent, he'll do that for a week and then maybe never do it again. That seems to be what he stands for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think this is the most interesting thing about Thomas Frank, right? Is that Spurs have had 3 games this season: PSG, Burnley, and Manchester City. They've played completely differently in every single game, and I do think that is. I mean, it's too simplistic to say that Andrew's too attacking and Frank is more defensive, and being defensive equals pragmatism. I know that some people think that, but there's much more to it than that. But I think with Frank, it's the ability to come up with a radically different plan for every single game based on the weaknesses of the opponent and your own strengths. That, I think, is what. And he was like this at Brentford as well. But from what I've seen of him at Tottenham so far, that is the thing that really stands out. I can't actually think of another manager. I mean, I was picking my brains about this earlier. The only one I could think of who was a bit like this was actually probably like Chelsea second time around, Mourinho, where the team, you did feel like the team could play in a different way based on different opposition week in, week out.
I think it maybe goes back to, I think Jonathan might have a better perspective on this than me, but I wonder whether it goes back to kind of late 90s Serie A, early 2000s, the kind of early Benitez Mourinho era, where the game was much more about, can the coach come up with an idea it tended to be to stop the opposition rather than to create different stuff. But it was very much like, you will change the way you play in order to counteract what the opponents are going to do. It felt much more like you maybe, again, we didn't, we've established that we didn't talk about it in those terms, certainly in England, but you kind of changed yourself to suit the occasion in a way that fell out of fashion with the rise of Guardiola. Is that what we're seeing come back, Jonathan?
Yes, I think to an extent, because there was always this idea in English football, you always heard it said of, we're good enough, we don't need to change for the opposition, which obviously is ludicrous. And the thing is that even people like Brian Clough, who would have been very reluctant to talk about this in public, he made tweaks in individual games. When they beat Hamburg in the European Cup final, they play a 4-5-1. When they draw with Liverpool to complete the victory over Liverpool in the European Cup in 78-9, so we won 2-0 at the City Ground. They draw 0-0 at Anfield, and as they're going out, like literally the last second, as they're going out onto the pitch at Anfield, Clough pulls Archie Gemmill aside and says, "Pretend you're a second right back today." And what is that but saying, well, we're going to stop Liverpool's left side? Clough wouldn't sort of do it with a big demonstration, loads of diagrams. He did it on an individual level, because even when Clough's putting a team together, what he was, he said, "Oh, we never had grand visions, we never had theories." Well, no, but when you're buying the players, you're buying them because you know that introducing that player will have this impact on the rest of the system, and you're automatically balancing that out. When he's walking around Albert Park in Middlesbrough with Peter Taylor, when they're both players there, and they're talking about football endlessly, what are they talking about? They're surely not going, "He's a good player, he's a bad player." I
like shooting. I really like it when you shoot.
Like the thing that they must be talking about the internal balance of sides. That's the only thing that's interesting, right? At a certain level. So sorry, but the point is that when Mourinho and Benitez turn up, what they both have in common, and if their philosophy, if you want to call it that, is to control games. And when they both arrive in English football in the same summer in 2004, you've got Ferguson, you've got Wenger, and the football is still quite wild, certainly compared to what we were seeing in the Champions League at the time. And Ferguson's begun to try and adjust that in Europe. And they turn up and they say, "Well, we're going to control it." But their way of controlling it is to adapt to the opposition. But that's a very reactive style, which is very contrary to the instincts of English football.
But then it feels to me a little bit like we can if we accept that the language around this has changed, and that's natural because as pretentious word salad merchants like ourselves start to make our influence felt on the game, there has been unquestionably, and it sounds stupid, and it probably is self-aggrandizing. I think the generation of journalists that we belong to, even Jack, who's much younger than me and you, we probably have some responsibility for this in terms of intellectualizing elements of the game.
Well, one of us wrote a book that probably introduced the word philosophy into football. I didn't mean to do it, but sorry.
Yeah. So you can take
in Breaking the Pyramid, still available. Yeah.
But that there has been this intellectual, and this is something we should definitely we should devote an episode to, I think, which is the kind of the intellectual run, basically, certainly in England, from fever pitch onwards, this desire to intellectualise football, to take this working class sport and make it palatable for the middle classes. We probably have some fault here. So the words have changed, the language have changed. There is more jargon now. There's no question about that. There is a desire to make things sound a lot more complicated than maybe they need to be, and maybe that's the story of this whole thing, which is, we've taken things that have always been within football and just put fancy words on them. But is there a point at which pragmatism will replace philosophy as the ultimate kind of characteristic, the ultimate positive trait a manager can have? Or do we think that pragmatism itself will come to be seen as a philosophy? Because to me, Jack, it feels like we are now in a stage where football clubs particularly want to be seen to stand for something. They want to. I don't think that's gone. I think they still want a manager who says, this is what I do, even if the thing they do is changed to suit the opposition.
Yeah, I think it's much too early to call time on what you might call the ideological turn in English football, even with Amorim's struggles and with Thomas Frank doing well. I think the fact is that clubs are, firstly, I think that it remains the case at the very, very top level, if you want to overperform, and this actually might be true lower down the pyramid as well, but if you really want to overperform, you need a clear set of ideas that that players can buy into. And I think that clubs are going to keep on appointing with that in mind. Like, just think about it, if you're a chief executive of a club, you want your club to have a brand. You want something which you can sell around the world. You want something which you can stick on a Netflix documentary, an Amazon documentary. And I think that having a manager with a recognizable set of ideas is a great way of doing that. I also think that as a fan, and I think this is kind of to do with the transfer market as well, is that clubs are all at risk of homogenization. Clubs have lost a lot of local identity, right, in the last sort of 20 years, simply because they don't really have so many local players. Right, they will often be reliant on players they brought in the transfer market, in managers they brought in perhaps from abroad. And in an era of delocalization, I think that having a really clear playing identity, and you can see this with, for example, but let's say Bielsa at Leeds. We've not even talked about Bielsa yet over the course of this episode, but I think he's a really important figure in this conversation. Like, if you have a manager with a clear set of ideas like that, then your club can have an identity, it can have something which it's recognised for around the world. And I think that is something that fans and players and executives, for what it's worth, they all want. And so I don't think we'll see any kind of backsliding in a kind of away from managers with these kind of sets of ideas.
And that feels really important to me, because the other thing that's happened is that obviously very few teams in football win anything. Isn't it? For a lot of teams, you are competing to get into the Europa League, and that feels like an animating purpose for a season, but then you also don't win the Europa League unless you are one of 6 or 7 Premier League teams and maybe 5 outside England in the big 5 leagues. Like, you're not winning the major honours. Obviously, within each country there will be a champion, but as the others discussed earlier this week, like in a lot of those leagues, you know who that's going to be now. Like, you know who the German champions are going to be. You know who will be champion in Bulgaria or Belarus. So the only reason to go and watch football is partly tradition and local identity and an expression of loyalty, and that's really important. But it's also, even within that, that's probably not enough to hold you. What you want is to feel as though you are on some sort of journey. And I think that's what Ange did really well at Spurs, was he took the fans on a journey, even if the way they actually got to the destination was completely different to what he'd said when they set out. That's my approach to driving as well. And for that, you need a philosophy. You need a set of ideas. You need to sort of say, we stand for something. And that might be promoting youth. It might be Athletic Bilbao and saying we're only going to use best players. We're going to see what, how far that can take us. It might be that you have a team, as a lot of sides sort of on continental Europe do now, even in France, particularly in France, where basically everyone's a teenager, or there's kind of a mix of 20-year-olds and 38-year-olds. You need to have something you stand for, because you need to convince the fans that they're going to the stadium not just to watch 22 players run around and play football. You need to convince them that what you're seeing is a battle of ideas. It's a sort of contest between two approaches, two things that mean something. Because otherwise, you kind of see the pointlessness of it.
But I think that's not necessarily new. Look at West Ham. Look at Everton. The academy, the School of Science. Look at Tottenham. Long before Ange, they were talking about the glory game. Audares facere. They're about, okay, we've only won 2 league titles, but we've not won in a really beautiful way. And I think, on the one hand, that's a very sort of valuable asset. Your style is its own reward, and I'm not against that. But equally, you also tend to see towards the end of managers' careers, when they maybe indulge slightly too long, that becomes an excuse. And I think you saw it with Clough. I think you saw it with Wenger. That early in Clough's time at Forest, early in Wenger's time at Arsenal, they had really quite tough, quite nasty players, and they won league titles. By the end of their time at Forest, Forest, I guess, kept winning League Cups and Arsenal kept winning FA Cups. But in terms of challenging for the league, they stopped doing it, and you can say that's for financial reasons rather than because the manager went into decline. But or both. But whichever that is, they stopped winning the league. But what they start doing is buying nice, polite young men who play nice, polite passing football. And for a while, at least, that becomes its own reward. The philosophy becomes the reward that, okay, you have the league is a trophy, but we've got our own special trophy that suits us and what we do.
I was trying to set you up to have the last word, Jonathan, but you've hit on my abiding theory of management, which eventually is that the managers become so consumed by their belief that their job is to prove that they are right. Winning stuff becomes immaterial. They have to try and win things in the way that they stand for. They become kind of overtaken by their philosophies, effectively, and that's definitely what happened to Wenger. Wenger stopped adapting. He stopped using an alloy of different qualities and started saying, well, I have to win in the correct way or it doesn't count.
The arc of history is long, but it tends towards self-parody.
Exactly. There you go. That feels like a suitably self-parodic note on which to finish. We've quoted Shakespeare. We've spoken in Latin. Thank you for listening. Unless you're a Manchester City fan who hates us because of what we think about PSR, Manchester City fans who don't hate us because of what we think about PSR, you're more than welcome. Please leave us a review on Spotify, follow us on YouTube, on Instagram. Jack has put us on TikTok. We are largely a collection of men in our 40s, and we are now on TikTok. That is in many ways testament to how devoted we are to you, the Libero listeners. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon.